Well, welcome everybody to this session at Clunes. We're absolutely delighted. It's a very special event today because Emily Bitto is here. My name's Helen Trinca and I'm just going to be asking the odd question and hopefully Emily will carry the day for us. It's a wonderful event actually because of course, as most of you know, Emily won the Stella Prize, just announced a couple of weeks ago. The Stella, yes, indeed. And the Stella is really a wonderful prize. It was set up, as most of you would know, as a sort of a counter activity to the male bias perceived at that point in the Miles Franklin. Be that as it may, lots and lots of girls in the Miles Franklin this year, I think. But it's a wonderful prize, and Emily pulled off a double coup, really, because it's the first time that a first novel has won the Stella Prize, so it's a debut novel, The Strays, and it's a great novel. So welcome, Emily. The interesting thing about, I'll just tell you what the judges said about the book. And they said it was a book about families, art, isolation, class, childhood, friendship, and the power of the past, which means it's about lots and lots of things. I read it and loved it and thought it was about a few other things as well. But I just wanted to ask you, Emily, as the first question, is it really also about you? And tell us about Lily, the narrator.
It's not really about me, I don't think. I mean, I definitely drew on some, I guess, sort of emotional experience, I guess, in my own life, and probably the one that I've sort of talked most about is just that experience of growing up an only child. I do actually have a half-brother and sister who I'm really close to, but I didn't grow up in the same house as them. So I essentially sort of grew up with the feeling that I was an only child, and probably that is the most sort of autobiographical element of the story. But in terms of the actual details of the plot, it's not about me.
Tell us just a little bit about the story, just to set it up for those people who may not have read it yet.
Yeah, it's narrated by a woman called Lily. She's sort of narrating, or we kind of meet her at the beginning of the book later in life, and she's looking back on her childhood. She'd probably be in her sort of mid-60s at the sort of present point of the narrative, and she's sort of, something has happened, which is that she's got an invitation to a retrospective exhibition at the National Gallery of Victoria, and that's brought up all of these kind of memories for her about her time that she spent as a child and a teenager around this group of artists, and the friendship she had with the daughter of one of the artists. And she had a very sort of close friendship with this other girl when she was young. And she did grow up an only child. She sort of really became besotted with this group of artists that she spent time around. And so, yeah, it's really like there's a big sort of middle section in the novel which is kind of going back to that past experience and her childhood friendship. Yeah.
And the past experience, for those who haven't read it, is really the 1930s in Melbourne, isn't it? She's a child in Melbourne in the 1930s. There's a lovely line in it about being besotted by the family and sort of the little girl, Lily, and they meet when they're 8 or so, don't they? And she sort of falls in love with this large, sort of rambling, makeshift, artistic family. And I just wondered, and from that is, that's the core of the novel, really, I think. Will you just read a little tiny bit just to get into it, just from the beginning of the book, and start, if you like, on page 1, if you like, and just...
Yeah, no worries. So this is from the sort of prologue section, which is, this present time when Lily's a bit older. I read once that the heart's magnetic field radiates up to 5 metres from the body, so that whenever we are within this range of another person, our hearts are interacting. The body's silent communications with other bodies are unmapped and mysterious. A linguistics of scent, colour, flushes of heat, the dilating of a pupil. Who knows, what we call instant attraction may be as random as the momentary synchrony of 2 hearts' magnetic pulses. Eva's mother believed in past life connections, that two souls can be twinned over and over, playing out different roles, so that in one life they may be mother and daughter, in another husband and wife, in a third dear friends. I only know that throughout my life I've felt an instinctive attraction to particular people, male and female, romantic and platonic. Attraction inexplicable at the time, but for a certain mutual recognition. It was this way with Eva, although we were only 8 years old. I remember that day after it all fell apart, when Eva came to me through the misty garden, so that her red coat bled into view from white to pale rose to scarlet. The pride I felt, that I was the one she turned to, that I could give her what her own family could not. All those years as part of the Trenthams' lives, feeling loved but never needed, never family. I'm an only child. It is my lot to be envious, even grasping, to long for the bonds that tie sisters together, the fearless, unthinking acceptance that we are social creatures, pack animals, that there is never truly the threat of being alone.
Thank you. It's a very ambitious novel, I think, Emily, both in what it's saying about human relationships and also in some ways about the background. So tell us a little bit about the background, the Heidi connection.
So I sort of decided to set the novel in this particular sort of period in the 1930s and 40s, partly because I was sort of familiar with, you know, the stories of that time. Probably a lot of people here are familiar with the Heidi circle. Does anyone kind of not know about that background?
You know, Sydney Nolan,
yeah,
Sunday
so
Reid. Yeah.
Basically it was this couple, John and Sunday Reid, who were, you know, quite wealthy and took into their home quite a lot of younger artists and encouraged them to sort of live there and create and live sort of side by side, and it was sort of the start of modernism in Melbourne as well. And so it's kind of a period that really fascinated me because, you know, you've got this kind of quite bohemian lifestyle going on in this kind of group of people, also this very, very new, different kind of art that's being made that was actually kind of truly radical at the time in a way that I think is kind of quite hard to get our heads around now, in that, you know, there were very serious consequences for artists choosing to kind of go against the mainstream of what was sort of being encouraged in the mainstream art community. Like, for example, younger artists painting sort of abstract work were being shut out of galleries and exhibitions, not allowed to hang their work, and even, you know, having their work kind of seized by the vice squad and things like that. So there was a lot of kind of interesting stuff going on, and I think just that juxtaposition of you know, really radical stuff going on in particular little pockets of Australian culture, you know, and then against what was a very conservative mainstream culture at the time. Yeah.
I'm interested in knowing why you decided to use that Heidi background, and obviously you've you've merged all the characters. You can't find out, you know, don't go looking for which one is Sydney Nolan and which one is Sunday Reid. But why could you have written this book, or did you think about writing this book with a different background? Why did you choose this background?
Yeah, I mean, I did. Like, I knew I wanted to write about some sort of group of people that were trying to sort of cut themselves off from or separate themselves from mainstream culture. And, you know, I guess the other era that struck me as potentially being, you know, lending itself to that kind of subject matter is like the 60s, that sort of counterculture movement. But like I sort of said, I think just the juxtaposition with the very conservative kind of mainstream society, I think, sort of drew me to this period.
Why do you think you're so interested in separation, in the idea of people being separated out, you know, being observers of family or observers of a culture?
I mean, I think partly probably, like I said, from that experience of kind of growing up an only child and feeling myself sort of on the outer a lot because of that. But also I think I think that the idea of like an artist community just seemed to me such a, an interesting thing to fictionalise, because, I think often people who are drawn to that kind of lifestyle are very interesting people, and then you get all of these people kind of together and you see what happened in that Heidi circle, for example, and it's stranger than fiction. I think part of why I didn't literally draw on those stories is they're just so, what went on in that house was so kind of dramatic that it would have looked crazy on the page. It would have sort of turned into melodrama, but I think, it's just, to me, it's sort of just undeniably interesting and such a great setting for fiction, because you've got these very strong characters all coming together with this sort of utopian ideal, and then these kind of power struggles that inevitably go on when you have a group of people that all sort of think of themselves as special in some way, I guess.
Did you find it difficult to work out how to sort of meld the research with the fiction, because it is a very well researched book, and I could imagine knowing so much, and then there's a lot of material that in a sense is excessive in a way, unnecessary for a fiction. Can you talk about that process of how you did that and how long it took you to separate the sort of fact from the fiction?
Yeah, it was definitely sort of a delicate thing for me, because I knew from the start that I didn't want to write the kind of novel that, wears its research too heavily. Basically because I don't enjoy reading that sort of historical fiction and the kind of fiction where you're constantly getting taken out of the narrative by this sort of very obvious, detail that belongs to that kind of historical period. So, I guess how I got around that was really by writing the first draft of the novel before actually doing the detailed research. I knew those kinds of stories that, about the Heidi Circle and things like that, but, the actual sort of detailed research and the stuff that I had to kind of look into to go, okay, was this song around at this time, or would they have been eating this, or all of that sort of stuff I did afterwards, and I did it as needed. So I would kind of check a scene and sort of think, have I put in anything in there that's really anachronistic, and do I need to sort of check that?
Yeah.
But yeah, so it was about order, I think, for me, and letting the story come out first before doing that research.
Yeah, the story is about friendship and lots of other things, as we've said, and we'll get on to, and isolation and separation. But it's also is about art, and it's about artists. And I suppose what comes through in the story is the incredible selfishness, in some way, of the adults in the story. Will you talk about that a little bit, and what you were trying to say in that, and whether are you talking about adults generally or artistic adults?
I think the other sort of research that is kind of related to this novel for me was, so I wrote this novel as one half of a creative writing PhD at Melbourne Uni, and at Melbourne, because they're sort of quite research oriented, you have to do a big research project alongside the creative. And the research project that I carried out was looking at representations of I guess the sort of figure of the artist in a broad sense, and how artist characters had been represented in quite contemporary fiction mainly, but looking back to, the sort of myth of what it is to be an artist that came mainly from Romanticism, and that's still quite kind of dominant. And part of that research kind of revealed to me how gendered that myth of the artist is, and how the kind of romantic myth of the tortured genius artist, the kind of true authentic artist, is very kind of masculine, very like removed from what is kind of seen to be ordinary life, and inherently kind of implicitly superior to that. And I think what I kind of wanted to partly do, and what that research kind of how it fed into writing the novel, was that I wanted to place that sort of, in some ways, kind of stereotypical figure of the kind of tortured masculine genius artist within a family and within a kind of domestic environment, and to kind of look at the fact that you know, these sort of quite privileged masculine artists throughout history have always kind of been in that situation. They've always had kids. There's always been a wife usually kind of supporting their artistic practice in the background, and not to kind of do that in a really sort of you know, political way. Obviously it's a kind of narrative first and foremost, but yeah, I think I just was interested in exploring that, in kind of looking at the family that would be around this artist character, and sort of letting those people that are surrounding the artist kind of emerge as equally interesting and important characters.
It's an interesting book because you're absolutely right, you don't overcook the politics of that, which I think is clever for two reasons. One is that at the time, you know, in the 30s, the politics would have been completely subliminal.
Yeah.
And the assumption was always that, clearly, you know, Sid Nolan was obviously going to be far more important to the world than any female partner. And then the other thing is, I think it really has a great integrity, because the story is, you know, one is much more sympathetic. It's much more rounded story, you know, and one likes Evan, you know, the male father figure artist, you know, who's ultimately the narcissistic adult who, you know, has an impact on the rest of his family. What you're talking about, writing this as part of, you know, creative writing. A lot of people, well, not a lot, people like me, sometimes think that a creative writing course and process is potentially too formulaic for good writing. How did you feel that? What do you like about having done a creative writing course and a PhD, obviously? And what did you have to sort of forget about when you started actually writing, you know, this novel?
I mean, I think my background is probably less of a sort of traditional creative writing course. Like my undergrad degree was in literature, and so the creative writing PhD is actually kind of more of just, it just gives you that freedom to kind of design your own project. So I haven't actually gone through the kind of creative writing course where you get sort of taught
how to write.
I guess, you know, for me, that education that's been pivotal for me is just studying literature and reading and reading and reading. Like, to me, that's kind of how I learnt to write, through just reading a lot, and obviously writing a lot as well. But you know, the creative writing PhD, on the other hand, I found incredibly valuable, because you basically just enrol. I was lucky enough to get a scholarship, which, you know, is not really enough to kind of live off, but it means that you don't have to work as much. And I had a supervisor who was excellent, Kevin Brophy at Melbourne Uni, and so you have kind of weekly or fortnightly meetings with your supervisor, but apart from that, you're kind of just on your own. You know, they kind of go, okay, go away and come back in 3.5 years with a thing and submit it. So, I mean, that has its own challenges, obviously, but I definitely didn't find it too formulaic. It was almost the opposite. It was sort of a lot of self-direction needed. Yeah.
Just a couple of things. How long did it take you to complete?
So the PhD was 3.5 years. I didn't sort of spend, because I had to do that 50% research as well. It was kind of about balancing the two parts. So I wrote the first draft of the novel probably in about 1.5 years, and then I kind of put it aside for a while and went and sort of did a lot of that research, and then came back and revised it. And then once I actually had finished the PhD and then signed up with the publisher, I had to kind of go back and revise it again, do a lot more kind of re-editing and things like that. So I was working on it for sort of 4 years, really.
Yeah. I've read interviews since you won the Stella where you say you've always been obsessed with, I think, writing and words. So tell us a little bit about that. Were you writing little stories when you were 5 years old?
Yeah, I was. Yeah, I think it's just, I guess it's something that's come very strongly from all my family members. You know, I think my mum's an English teacher and read to me all the time when I was a kid. My dad, you know, is a very kind of interesting person and is constantly sort of telling stories. And yeah, I think just something I grew up saturated with, and
you wrote poetry first, and I think you can see that in your prose, the poetry. So, how do you feel about will you keep writing poetry? Have you found a new voice now, and you've tossed poetry aside?
Well, I mean, I actually really miss poetry, but while I was writing The Strays, I found I couldn't write poetry. It's almost like everything, all of those little experiences you have and thoughts you have that maybe I would have previously kind of channeled into a poem were all being just fed into the novel. And so, that was actually kind of upsetting at the time, because I thought I could keep poetry going alongside writing the novel, but it just...
You'd lost your muse for a moment.
Yeah. Or everything just went into this, I guess, instead.
Yeah. I just thought we might talk a little bit about this notion of friendship, which is again at the core of the novel, because Lily, the narrator, and Eva, the daughter of the artist, have this very quite close friendship. I guess there's a lot to be said about it, but one thing that I've always found interesting, and it comes through a little bit in the book, is that the ease at which friends can betray each other at certain points. And I wondered if you would talk a little bit about that and the context of the book, and how important that sort of word was to you when you were thinking about the book.
Friendship.
Friendship or betrayal, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think, friendship and friendship between women or young women was something that I really wanted to write about, particularly with this book. And partly I think because, I know for myself and a lot of my female friends, it's something that's so central to our lives and something that's so important, and yet I think it's something that doesn't really get much of a look in literature. If you look at the sort of canon of Western literature, in terms of statistically, there's so much emphasis placed on romantic relationships and relationships between men and women, and I think that the centrality of female friendship in life is just not kind of given justice, I think. But yet, of course, I didn't want to just write something that was all kind of glowing account of the amazingness of friendship. And I think, this time in your life as well, that is kind of the main period the book is set, which is when the girls are sort of probably about 15, 16. I think you're right, there are a lot of kind of complex things going on, and often there is a sense of kind of betrayal, probably just naturally because you're at that age, you're kind of trying to work out who you are, and you're just constantly trying to work out where you fit in and who you want to be like and who you want to kind of surround yourself with. And it's a very kind of, I think you see things in a very cut and dried sort of way at that age as well, and things that you could probably forgive and work through later in life are just absolutely huge disasters. But I think, what happens in the friendship between Lily and Eva, it's not about whether they could have stayed friends. I think they could have, but it's more about what their individual, where they're each going individually in their lives, and that they maybe just didn't kind of fit together.
There's a lovely sense in the book about the long sort of tale of events, if you know what I mean, in the sense that the past comes back, and the parents, the artistic parents, sort of the shadow that they cast, I suppose, upon their children is long and at times, quite dark. Which brings me to a point, which is it's not exactly an uplifting book. I don't know whether those who have read it, but it's a great book, and it's a compelling book to read, and it's a true book. But it's, in some ways, I came to the end of it and I thought, who do I like in this book? And that's, to be honest, as a reader, I don't search out that question, but I was kind of mindful this time that I wasn't sure whether any of the characters, whether even Lily is likeable enough. So, what did you feel when you came to the end of it? What did you feel about those characters yourself? And comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question, and I think I've had interesting responses from readers, particularly about Lily, who I did want to make you know, a flawed character in some ways. I think that was part of what kind of kept me interested in writing, particularly from that sort of first-person perspective, because I think that perspective gives you the freedom to sort of, you know, the narrator is a character in the book, and I very much sort of thought of Lily as someone who'd gone through her life with this very sort of particular idea of the past and a particular way of seeing her own past, and had really held on to a lot of kind of resentment about the past, and yet, you know, hoped that the reader could kind of see that in a bit more of a, you know, from a distance, and recognise Lily's motivations perhaps for having that way of viewing her own past, and then to kind of catch her, I guess, at a point in her life where she's forced to come up against, you know, other people's views on that same past, and to perhaps start to reconsider her own sort of view of her life. And I think that for me is what, you know, I like Lily, and I think luckily
Emily Bitto likes her main character.
Well, I feel for her, because she has, you know, she's forced to reevaluate what she's kind of been through, and I think for me that's kind of what maybe redeems her. But at the same time, I can definitely see that there are elements of kind of unlikableness in her, and in all of the characters probably. But then I have had readers say that they've really liked Lily as well. So.
And just we should have done this at the beginning a bit. Just the title. Talk about that. And did it take a long time to get that title, or was it always there from the beginning?
No, it wasn't actually there from the beginning. But luckily, it sort of just came out of a point in the PhD process where I think I had to submit like a 2-year review or something like that, and I had to write the title of the creative component, and it was, you know, the day I had to hand in these papers, and so I just kind of flicked through and found this title, and that's probably why I was actually happy with it, because otherwise I would have angsted about it for days. It just stuck, I think.
Will you talk a little bit about how you write? You've again said in interviews that you rather like, I think, connecting with other writers. I mean, I'm not saying I don't think you're in a writers' group as such, but obviously you don't want to be an isolated writer without connection. Yeah. How do you write every day?
I like writing in the morning. I think just trying to kind of turn it into a routine, and I think that's part of why I found that doing the PhD quite useful, because I guess before that, particularly writing poetry, I tended to, as is the sort of natural way of doing things, your life's busy, you kind of wait for that moment of inspiration to take you if you've got a little bit of time, and you sort of write something. And I'd, started lots and lots of kind of short stories and things in that way, and then never really, I just wasn't very good at kind of following through. I'd get another idea for the start of something that seemed suddenly so much more interesting, and move from one thing to the other, or write poems which are, you can sort of, I think, write in those moments of inspiration. But when I started the PhD and started writing a novel, I very quickly kind of went into an extreme hole of writer's block, and sort of thought, oh my God, where are the moments of inspiration? How can I do this every day? So it just became more about sort of creating a routine, actually kind of recognising that this is a form of work that you have to just produce every day, and whatever you do, it may not actually make it in there, it might be terrible, but I had this period of time, and I just thought, if I write every day,
get there,
I'll have a lot of words, and it will just be about editing and choosing. I think, and there's a sort of freedom in that as well, because you just kind of go, okay, well, if I write every day, at the end of a year, I'll have thousands and thousands of words, and I'll have a lot to kind of work with at least.
It's interesting. Kingsley Martin Amos's father once, I remember doing a story about it years and years ago, and his mantra was that he got down, because of course he was a professional writer and wrote lots and lots of novels, but he would get down, have breakfast, get down at the typewriter in those days, and not move from the typewriter in the study until he had 400 words on the page. and then he'd go out for lunch and go to the pub, because he's a huge drinker, and get completely drunk, and that was that. And then the next day get up and do it again. And so that routine, which he maintained, I think right until his death, meant that he wrote a lot, you know, and I've always thought it was a wonderful, it's an inspiring comment in a way, and it's completely counter to the notion of inspiration, isn't it? It's just the thing. You've actually said that you want to be a writer, and I think you've even mentioned, and I may be misverbling you, but you've said, you know, you're not thinking even of having family because you want to dedicate yourself to writing. Now, is that correct?
I think so. I mean, you know, there's always time to change my mind, but right now, I think, you know, I just want to, I really want to focus on writing.
So, and was that, do you think, when did you get that sort of, I know you've always been obsessed, you know, as we talked about, with words and writing. When do you think you got the idea of yourself being a writer? You know, not someone who wrote, but a writer, professional writer.
I don't know. I mean, maybe I don't even... It's a hard thing, I think, to actually think of yourself as a writer.
In our culture it is, isn't it? You know, the sort of notion that you could actually say that's going to be my career.
I guess for me it's more a passion. You know, I want to... That's what I want to kind of focus my energies on. Yeah,
great. I'm going to mention your day and night job, and a lot of people here would know that Emily and her partner and others run a bar in Melbourne, which I haven't been to, but many of you might have been to. Should give the name. I don't.
Yeah, Heart Attack and Vine it's called, which is a Tom Waits song.
And so have you been? And that's incredibly cool to be doing that. Of course, it's about as cool as being a winner of the Stella Prize. Are you spending time there, or have you?
Oh yeah, lots and lots of time.
Yeah. So is it quite a new venture?
So that's kind of. We only started the bar just coming up to 6 months ago. So the book has been out for a year now. So it was sort of. The bar opened about 6 months after the novel was published, and it sort of really was an attempt to kind of find a way of life and work that would give me a kind of sustainable lifestyle where I could kind of work around writing or work writing into my daily routine. And I sort of knew that initially it was definitely not going to be helpful, and I'm basically still working, you know, 70 to 80-hour weeks at the bar and not doing any writing. Yes. But you know, I'm hoping that it'll get easier.
Have you got another project? You don't need to tell us, but have you started on something else?
Yeah, I have. I'm in the very early stages, but doing lots of thinking about it, I guess, which to me is kind of almost as important. Just you know, like letting it start. Percolating.
We were talking before. I was saying to Emily that she'll be very busy now with lots of writers, you know, festival invitations, and of course I can't remember who it was, but a while ago I read a piece by someone who said basically she couldn't write any longer because she was constantly doing, you know, the events or the small thing that a newspaper asked her to do, you know, and so. The publicity, balancing the sort of publicity that's inevitably part of the marketing of the book and the next project is really quite challenging, but that's for another day. I'm wondering if people have questions, we can go to questions, otherwise we'll come back. But please do, because I think, have many people read the book? Yeah, and do you want to comment, even a comment on it? You can tell Emily how wonderful it is, or ask an insider question about it. Anyone interested in that?
Emily, given that you drew inspiration from events that are well known and not necessarily replicated those, but have you had any feedback from the
historians?
No, I haven't actually. I'd be really interested to talk to some of the people around that group, but yeah, I haven't.
Did you go? You obviously went to Heidi and know it well. Did you read? Autumn Lang? Yes, okay, yeah, that's great. Have other people read that book as well? Because I thought, I mean, I've read that book and I've read a bit about the reads, but I'd never been to Heidi until last year, and I managed to, after the grand final, because I'm a Sydney person, after the Swans had been annihilated the grand final. I went the next day to Heidi and had a wonderful time there. And as I was reading the book, I thought, your book, how, I mean, and I know it's not a, you know, a version of it really, but it was so, you know, it came back, it was very redolent, you know, resonant rather, the book. Any other questions from people? Okay, thank you.
At what stage of the writing process did you show your parents?
Can I just make sure everyone heard that? At what stage of the writing process did Emily show the manuscript to her parents?
I think when it was definitely a full draft. I don't think I really showed many people at all before it was kind of at least that first full draft finished, except for my supervisor. Yeah, I think I'm a little bit sort of superstitious about that personally. I know lots of people, you know, other writers that I know are in writing groups and things and show a lot of their work as they're going along, but I don't know, I think for me I don't know, it's so hard to actually sort of have the confidence to just keep going every day sometimes, that if you get negative feedback, I think it's just too risky.
But Emily, I think the point of the question was, what was your parents' reaction to it?
Yeah, you know.
They didn't take it as autobiographical.
No.
Phew. That's good. Any more? Are you interested in doing another little reading for us? Have you got something up your sleeve there, or is it too hard? You have a think about that.
Yeah.
And I'll scan the room again and just see whether anybody else would like to ask Emily. So people. The other thing I was just going to say, and I mentioned to Emily before, I had mixed feelings about this the Stella, because I was actually, I have to confess, barracking for someone else. And then Emily won. I thought, right, okay, that's fabulous, and I'll read this book, and I absolutely loved it and thought, what a worthy winner. But the point of telling you that little story is that I think the value of the Stella Prize is so fabulous, because I may not have read the book, because Emily is the first author who I wasn't sort of aware of, and you tend to go back often to the people that you know, and they get another book out, and at my age, I'm even rereading my old books. I love to read the books that I've read before, and I think what a wonderful, you know, it's just such a terrific thing, the Stella, because and really, I guess all prizes is that they bring to our attention, and they so much help us expand our vision. So that was great. And the other wonderful thing, just to tell you, is that according to the Financial Review yesterday, the numbers of copies of Emily's book, last year I think it sold 5,000 copies, and it sold virtually another 5,000 in the last 2 weeks since the publicity. So it's a terrific prize. Okay, so have you got something that you'd like to read?
Sure. So I thought I would just read the first introduction to my sort of the artist, Evan, who is the father of Lily's best friend, Eva, and this is her first kind of introduction to who the character that will kind of be the central artist kind of figure in the novel. On that first afternoon, Eva took me to meet her father in his studio, a large room on the ground floor of the house. The door was ajar, and Eva pushed it open and walked in without knocking. Evan Trentham resembled the pictures of fearsome bushrangers I'd seen in books. He was tall and lanky, with a red forest of a beard that parted in a grin when he saw his daughter. "Chook, chook, chooky!" he crowed horribly, setting down a long-handled brush and hoisting her into the air with his stringy arms, which were pale like Heloise's and covered in ginger hair. Evan Trentham was put together from mismatched stuff. The sinews were too short for the long bones. The tendons behind his ankles and the bald stones of his knees stuck out, hard as the catgut on a tennis racket. He was like a rubber band, stretched tight and close to snapping. He wore blue work pants cut off at the knee and a white undershirt that was yellow beneath the armpits. He was paint-stained and sweat-smelling. The room itself was cluttered with paint tins, brushes and books, and reeked of tobacco and turpentine. There was a green chaise longue behind the door, its horsehair stuffing erupting through a hole. A huge half-finished painting stood against the back wall. Eva giggled as her father nuzzled her with his beard. "Scratchy!" she squealed. Evan held out his hand to me, shifting Eva onto his hip. "Who's this then?" he asked. "Mrs. Tiggywinkle?" I was too scared to move and did not hold out my hand. "Don't be silly, Dada. It's Eva. It's Lily," said Eva. "Pleased to meet you, Lily Tiggywinkle," he said, a little more soberly. "Any friend of Eva's is a friend of mine. Do you like barley sugar?" I nodded, mute, and he offered me a tin of yellow barley sugars melted together around a teaspoon. I hesitated. He passed the tin to Eva. "Show her how it's done, Chookabiddy." Eva dug around in the tin with the spoon and then prized the barley sugar off with her teeth, showing me how it stuck in the roof of her mouth. Cautious of germs, I took the tin and dug out a small lump, pulling it off the spoon, wet with Eva's spit, with my fingers. "Will you play Billy Goat Gruff with us?" Eva asked her father. "Not now, Chook, still working." Evan put her down and turned back to his canvas. Eva stamped her foot and went and sat on the chaise longue, and I followed her. I remember staring up at the giant painting Evan was working on. It was one of his now iconic desert scenes, filled with figures intertwined in an obscenity of postures against the scorching earth. My eyes darted between blues and ochres until I made out the terrible images of policemen in uniform bent over one another, some with mouths wide open. One policeman was tilting a barrel of liquid into the mouth of another. The barrel had a hose attached to it at the top, and it led across the canvas to the back of an outdoor dunny. My throat grew tight. I wanted to look away, but I could not. Eva nudged me and pushed a book towards me, open on a black and white reproduction of an artwork. I looked down at the tortured image and asked, "Did he paint that too?" Across the room, Evan laughed. "A man called Hieronymus Bosch painted it. Isn't that a wonderful name? Don't you wish you were called Hieronymus Bosch? He painted it a very long time ago. I'm just pilfering from him. Bosch in the bush, I like to call it." "What's pilfering?" I asked. "Stealing," said Evan. I didn't know what he meant, only that the book gave me the same rotten feeling in my stomach as Evan's painting.
Oh, lovely. And that's actually a lovely piece because it does actually show Lily's, gradual sort of being a world being revealed to her too. And I wondered if you'd talk a little bit about class, because a big factor in this book is the class and the difference between Lily's world and Eva's world. So Lily's background is very sort of probably lower middle class. Her parents are kind of struggling a lot, and the kind of childhood part of the novel is set sort of just after the main part of the Depression, and so her parents have come through a very, very difficult time, whereas Helena, who is Eva's mother, is kind of old money, and from one of the sort of wealthy, established sort of Melbourne families, and so in some ways they're kind of some of the only people who've kind of come through the Depression relatively unscathed. And so I think that's, there's that sort of background as well, and the fact that, Lily's parents are kind of very much sort of living an ordinary life, and suddenly, she's kind of at the age when she meets Eva and her family, where she's starting to kind of think about what she wants for her own life, and suddenly kind of has this idea, I could lead an extraordinary life, and she sees these sort of wealthy, bohemian kind of artists, and suddenly sort of sees a whole world of opportunity opening up in front of her. But I guess what I sort of also wanted to hint at is just the class sort of question behind that, and the fact that these artists are able to lead the life that they lead because they've sort of got this money, and they're able to sort of, to some extent, free themselves from the sort of consequences that they might face if they weren't bolstered by that money, and kind of able to kind of cut themselves off and not care too much about what other people think of them. I know you've said that we've talked about the fact that the novel isn't autobiographical, but I actually think that nobody in Australia writes about class or chooses to write about class unless they have some skin in the game, in a sense, to put it that way. So what I want to know is why does class come into this, and is it about stuff that's in your own sort of circle, your own life? I mean, did you feel, the most obvious banal question, I suppose, is, did you feel more of an outsider in some situations, like the Lily character?
I don't know where my thinking about class really comes from. I guess, maybe partly it's more from the sort of research that I've done than my own experience. I guess to me it's maybe more that question of sort of who is thought of as kind of ordinary versus extraordinary, and I think class and also gender very much sort of play into those questions, and that's sort of something I guess that I've thought about a lot growing up. I think, maybe where the kind of class questions come into it for me is, my dad escaped from communist Czechoslovakia in the Prague Spring, and I would often, spending time with him, go and spend time visiting his friends who were kind of often living very kind of ordinary, very sort of working class lives, often living in, working in factories and kind of living out in the western suburbs. And I was a kid and just would be hanging around in the background, but through that sort of very much just came to realise that the stories that everyone kind of has, and that all of these people had these incredible stories that they would tell, and that they would kind of sit around telling with my dad, and it just was something that I really thought about, that wanting to, I guess, think about those questions of what is ordinary and what is extraordinary, and what choices do we make in our lives to, live either what we think of as a kind of extraordinary life, or do we kind of content ourselves with a kind of, quote, ordinary life, and all of those sort of questions were things I guess I was thinking about from a young age because of those kind of experiences.
I was kind of interested in it because I think children of migrant families or migrants are outsiders, My own background is Italian, and I've often thought we sat outside the class structure in a way growing up, because you didn't exactly know where you sit, and it wasn't an issue, it wasn't a problem as such, but and I was born in Australia, but so I'm fascinated by the fact that in a sense your father's and his cohort were sort of outsiders to certainly powerful Australia.
Definitely.
So was that in Melbourne or in?
In Melbourne.
Okay.
Yeah.
And your mother is not from a migrant background?
No.
Very interesting. Lovely. All right. Now, anyone else sort of a question that they'd like? No? Anyone? One down there? No? Yes, good. Thank you.
More on the Stella Prize. Emily just speaking about class and gender and the life of an artist. How do you think the Stella Prize will affect your future as a writer?
Oh, I mean, it's undoubtedly had a huge impact on me already. I mean, even what you mentioned in terms of like book sales, it's had a huge boost. It's only just over a week since the prize was announced, and not only the book sales, but I've managed to secure a US agent, and got all of these amazing kind of invitations to writers' festivals like this one, and I think it's incredible. Not only what that experience is for me as a prize winner, but I think just what the Stella Prize has managed to do in its sort of 3 short years in terms of raising questions about, or bringing the question of gender and the gender inequality that exists in the literary world into the public spotlight. And apparently the Stella Prize and the Miles Franklin obviously are really the two main prizes that kind of bring that boost in sales. You know, the Stella's only been around for 3 years, and I think that that's really incredible what they've kind of done in terms of really establishing that prize and what they are able to give to the writers on not just the winner but the short and long list. I think it's just, and it's, you know, a prize that I feel very kind of passionate about, because as I think, you know, all of the stuff that I've sort of talked about in terms of my interests in the artist and what it means to be an artist and who gets to kind of think of themselves and call themselves an artist, and the gender sort of questions that have historically really clustered around that topic. You know, traditionally, historically, women's kind of creative production has been more seen as, you know, a hobby or a sort of entertainment or kind of low culture, and so I think, you know, what the Stella Prize is doing to try and sort of remedy that situation and just get people talking about it is just amazing.
And has anyone come with a film contract yet?
No, not yet.
The next one. Any other questions? That's great. Well, I think we might, actually we've got, where are we? Are we 4:23, or we've got some little bit more time. Actually, on that point, I mean, do you? Some people dislike the marketing element of a book. You know, the political element of getting a book sold. How do you see all that fitting in? You know, are you do you recognise the
do you mean like the publicity, the post-public?
Some people really, you know, feel as if it's not pure enough for the process of the artist. You know.
I mean, I can't say it's something that necessarily comes naturally to me, but I do, you know, I definitely, it's just a fact of the publishing industry now that you know, you have to raise awareness of the fact that your book exists and get people to know about it to be able to read it, and I think that that's something that's, you know, it is hard, particularly for a debut writer, to kind of make people aware of your book in the first place. So I think that's just a fact of life, and I think it's something that, you just need to do. And there's really nice sides to it as well, you know, meeting people, and I love this kind of thing. It's more the, you know, radio interviews that are a little bit challenging.
Yes. And we might just talk a little tiny bit about your decision to go with this particular publisher. How did that happen? Because Affirm Press, I think you're the first author that they published, so it's the first production really.
They'd been around for a little while, but they sort of expanded a bit and brought on new editor and new marketing kind of team, and so yeah, I was the first fiction book that they published after that sort of expansion. Yeah, so it was definitely, it was actually kind of a tough decision to make, to go with an independent publisher, but I think for me, like, the most important thing for me was to make sure I was going to get a really good kind of editing experience and get that time sort of to work with an editor on developing the manuscript. You know, and I do know friends who've gone with, you know, bigger publishing houses and haven't quite got as much time to work on their manuscripts and the sort of sense of collaboration that you get in a really good, positive kind of editing experience. So that for me was kind of the crux of why I wanted to go with an independent
Lovely. Well, it's a great outcome, and congratulations
Thank
again.
you.
I'd just like to say thank you very much. Thank you for being so generous with your commentary, and very well done. It's fantastic. And please join with me in